Hello and welcome back to Economics with Professor Klein. All right, so today in this video, we're going to discuss the 5 foundations for economics or for economic thinking. And so this is really what I mean by if you learn just a little bit of economics, if you learn this and maybe opportunity cost, which is one of the ones that we'll see here in just a moment, it can really change how you approach making decisions. All right, so the first foundation of economics is simply that people respond to incentives. Now, when we talk about incentives from an economics perspective, we're going to describe them in 4 different ways, right? And so we're going to see that we can discuss them as direct incentives versus indirect. And then the other thing that I want to make clear very quickly here is that we also talk about incentives as positive incentives versus negative incentives, right? And so the problem is that in economics, we often talk about incentives and maybe we mean a negative incentive. This is not the language that would be used outside of the econ classroom. Instead, probably outside the econ classroom, they would call a negative incentive a punishment, right? So often we think outside this classroom as incentives and punishments. In economics, we just think about the incentive. Is it positive, right? Is it giving you praise or, for instance, a raise, right? Where there's a positive result of doing something that we wanted you to do versus negative, right? Which means that we're going to punish you for not doing something that we wanted you to do. And the other way that we classify incentives is direct versus indirect. Now, every time I think about direct versus indirect, here is my really terrible picture of a glacier, right? What we always see in these pictures, and hopefully you're taking a science class that will teach you more about these things, is that what we see is often very small compared to what is underneath the water. And the reason why I use that is because direct, those are the observable incentives. And usually they're pretty easy to pick out. So for example, if your mom ever said, I'm only going to give you your allowance if you clean your room. That's a clear, direct incentive. You clean your room, you get your allowance, right? Indirect, however, become much more important, and most of our incentives become indirect, particularly the older we get. Here's one that you might not have thought about. You have made the decision to enroll in this class. You faced incentives, right? Now, when I think about why do people enroll in economics, it's not like they know me and they really just want to hear me talk, though hopefully that's the case for microeconomics students. But what happens is, here's what's going down. You've been told, right, that in order to earn a living salary, right, a living wage, you need to get a job. And you need to get a job that requires a college degree. So you enrolled in college to try to get that college degree, to try to get that job that will pay you a living wage. Right? And then as we work backwards, you want that living wage, so you enrolled in college to get a college degree, and so you have signed up here and you've started your journey, and so you've taken economics because they said, get a business degree, right? And so the indirect incentive of why are you here? You're here in a very long way to get a better paying job, right? So that's an indirect incentive because it's not like once you finish this course, suddenly that job is going to come calling, right? It's building a foundation for a long-term goal. And so that's why I say most of the incentives that we face, right, are indirect because we have to think longer term as to why. Why would we choose to do something, right? Because again, economics is the study of how we make decisions. Okay. So that's the first one. People respond to incentives. And so we're going to classify them in 4 possible ways. Direct, meaning I can observe them. Indirect, I really have to think about why am I doing this. Positive, I'm going to get a positive outcome from this. Or negative, somebody's going to punish me, right? I'm trying to avoid punishment, so I'm going to do this. So after we do people face incentives, The second one that follows is that people face trade-offs. All right, we face trade-offs. And so this happens all the time. So for example, you're going to face a trade-off with this class. You can either, because again, if we think about this from a very personal perspective of making decisions, we only have so much time. So let's say that we can either take Econ 201A, or we have time to take maybe Nutrition 201, right? And they're both going to bring about good things. We're going to get to know our, what we need to eat here, and that's really important, right? And so we have to face a trade-off. Maybe they're both happening at the same time, or maybe you can take multiple ones. Maybe you're making the decision you have to face a trade-off of taking 5 classes and only working 20 hours a week, which, by the way, is a lot. If you're doing that, that's a lot. Or you're facing the trade-off of maybe I'll only take 3 classes and I'll work 30 hours a week. The trade-offs can be different. They're not always going to be the same for everybody. But what we're saying is that when we're making decisions, we have to think about what we want, right? And if you've ever seen House Hunters or House Hunters International, we talk about these trade-offs all the time. For example, if you're trying to buy a house, sometimes the trade-off is it's close to work, or it has a pool. And so you have to think about what's more important, right? And not everyone is going to make the same decision. This is where things get difficult in economics, right? Our priorities will be different. And so we might make different decisions. And so really, we're also going to talk later on, positive versus normative statements. We make normative statements when we judge someone's decision, right? Whereas positive statements are simply giving them facts to help them make that decision. And so again, people face trade-offs, and it's always going to be a question of what's your priority, right? Same thing here. What's your priority? Do you want to get done with school faster, or do you need to make money now, right? Trade-offs. The third is very similar to trade-off, and this is, again, one of those that can totally change your perspective on how you make decisions. And that is, we incur opportunity cost. So this is second or third definition that we really start to get into when we talk about economics. We incur, we always say incur when there's a cost, right? We incur an opportunity cost. That's interesting, right? So it's not that we're giving up money, right? It's that we're giving up an opportunity. And so when we think about this, I really think that the best way we think about opportunity cost is with an example. So here's one that I like to think of for students. Let's say you're trying to determine your summer plans, right? And you've come up with 3 possible options that you think are pretty awesome. One is an unpaid internship at this really awesome firm doing what you love, right? But it's unpaid. It's paying you in experience. That's always my favorite. The second, let's say you get an outside job, maybe being a lifeguard or something similar, and it's going to pay you $20 an hour for the summer, right? And then the third one, as you're trying to get these opportunities for yourself, your friend comes up to you and says, hey, we're going to travel, we're going to backpack, right? Maybe around Europe, maybe we're going to go to Australia. We're going to go travel. Do you want to come with us, right? These are all possibilities that you could line up. And these are all different things that I did during my college summers, right? I was not a lifeguard, but worked someplace different. So how do you make this decision, right? Because there are some trade-offs here as well, right? If I do the unpaid internship, well, then I don't have money. How am I going to pay for classes next year? If I take the job, well, then how am I going to get my foot in the door if I never get some experience in this? Oh, and if I do either of those, well, then I can't backpack to Europe. I'm going to face some trade-offs here. What opportunity cost is, you can have tons of trade-offs, right? We could list other things that you could do here. We could list other jobs, right? And so we could have lots and lots of trade-offs. Here's what an opportunity cost does. It just simply whittles it all down, and an opportunity cost says, okay, you've got these three possibilities, but the opportunity cost is what you would have done. So here's something I normally do in class. I have you all vote, right? I say, how many of you would take the unpaid internship? How many of you would take the lifeguarding job? And how many of you would go backpacking through Europe? So I'm just going to use some random numbers. Let's say that 20 choose the unpaid internship, 10 choose the lifeguard, and 12 choose the travel to Europe, right? So based upon this information, and if this is how, if you came up with pros and cons, and if you came up with this list, here's what's going to happen. We're going to eliminate one, right? We still have this trade-off, but we're going to eliminate one because lifeguarding is our least preferred way we're going to use our time. So what happens is, we're going to take that unpaid internship and our opportunity cost, we're going to simplify it to only one trade-off. So we're going to simplify it to, our opportunity cost is, we're not going to be able to backpack through Europe, right? It's the value of the lost opportunity, what you would have done. So this is where things get a little different, right? Let's say that this was a morning class, because typically I teach in the morning. And you had to decide between coming to class or going to the gym, right? And you're having this trade-off, and you've decided you're going to come to class because that's what you signed up for. Well, on those days where it's really hard to get out of bed, is the opportunity cost going to the gym? No. On those days where it's really hard to get out of bed, the opportunity cost is not going to the gym, it's sleeping in, right? And so that's the thing, opportunity cost is not going to be constant, nor is it going to be the same across people. It's subjective based upon what are the other things that you could be doing. And it's also subjective based upon what would you be doing, right? So if you started the semester thinking, I would have gone to the gym, and then midway semester, you're like, no, I would be sleeping in, your opportunity cost has changed. Now, whether or not that changes your decision remains to be seen. But essentially, opportunity cost whittles this all down to two options, what you've done and what you would have done. All right, the fourth one is that we engage, right? And you're going to see in your textbook, they call it the Homo economist, right? Because we're all Homo sapiens. And so they change the terminology to be people who think economically, right? And so this is where economics gets a little tough. People don't often engage in economic thinking unless they are taught economic thinking. So people engage, or economists engage in marginal thinking. What is marginal thinking? Well, it's looking at marginal benefits versus marginal cost. Okay, but we still haven't described what is marginal. Marginal means additional. So here's what it doesn't do. Marginal thinking ignores sunk costs. So what is a sunk cost? It's a cost we can't get back, right? It's an unrecoverable cost. We can't get it back. So let's think of an example that often people fail to engage in marginal thinking with this example. Let's say that you have a car that has broken down and it needs a new transmission. Something I faced when I was in college. Uh-oh, my car needs a new transmission. When we engage in marginal thinking, we try to think about what's the marginal benefit versus the marginal cost. Now, that means we ignore the sunk cost. So what is a sunk cost? Well, when we think about this, whatever I paid for the car, if I've had the car for 5 years, whatever I paid for that car 5 years ago, it's sunk. It's not like I can take that car back 5 years later to whoever sold it to me and say, hey, 5 years later, this needs a new transmission. They would go, well, then you probably should have driven it better or taken better care of it, right? This is no longer their problem. This is a sunk cost. So whatever we paid for that car initially, right, is now a sunk cost. What if I just got it brand new tires, right, three months ago? Or maybe I fixed the windows, right, because we could take the tires off. Maybe I fixed the windows 3 months ago. Well, that's also a sunk cost. I can't take it back to the guy who fixed it and say, you know what, I'm going to have to get rid of this car now. Can you give me my money back for fixing it, right? So we ignore those sunk costs. So what do we consider when making this decision if we want to engage in economic thinking, engaging in marginal thinking? Well, we want to think about marginal cost, right? This one is the easiest one to determine in this example. How much will it cost to fix the car? And this one is the easiest to figure out because we can go get an estimate from the repair shop, right? You take it in, you say my car's not doing so well, and they're the ones who let you know, oh, your transmission's busted, I can get you a new one. With the labor and parts, it's going to be $2,500. You go, wow, let me think about this, right? Well, you have one piece of information here. You have the marginal cost, the cost of fixing the car. The hard part, where we really lack here, is what is the marginal benefit? And this is where we don't have what we call perfect information. In a world where we can throw lots of questions into Google, here's one it can't answer. Google, if I fix the transmission on my car, how long will I be able to drive it until it needs another repair? Google can't tell you that, right? You can maybe ask the repair shop, but overall, we're going to have to make our best guess. And so this is the other thing about making decisions. Decisions are particularly difficult if we've only made it once. So it is really hard when people get started, hashtag adulting. When you get started making those decisions, yeah, you have very little information to go off of, right? Your parents were making these decisions for you previously because they had more information and they could make better ones. But no matter when you do this, at some point you have to start making these really difficult decisions, and they're not easy. They get easier the more you make decisions, right? And I said easier, not easy, right? Everything, one of the other things we'll learn in economics is that things are mostly relative, not absolute, right? And that's meaning easier, not easy. So this marginal benefit, I really have to go with, if it's $2,500 to fix the car, does it make sense? How long do I think? And maybe, maybe I'll ask my friends and I'll ask my parents what they think, and I'll try to get as much information as I possibly can. Well, my friend fixed their transmission and it worked for them for another 2 years, right? And then they ended up having to junk it. Would that be worth it to me? My parents tell me about a time that they fixed the transmission and it worked great for them for the rest of the life of the car, and they probably had it for 6 years. Well, gee, that would really work for me, right? Or, my mechanic says, yeah, that's not a great car. I think it would only last another 6 months before something else breaks down. And then here's a new question. Can I trust that information? What is his incentive? And that's where and this is where making decisions becomes really very difficult. So engaging in marginal thinking, the key here is we ignore sunk costs. We get rid of those unrecoverable costs, such as what was the original price of the car? What was the fix that I just made to this car a couple of months ago? And then finally, the last one that we are going to prove later on, it's going to come from opportunity cost. And that is trade makes us all better off. And so we will prove this as we go through an opportunity cost example in later chapters, in chapter 2 in particular. And so we're going to prove that trade makes us better off. But here's very simply, if we just think about one trade that we engage in, right? DoorDash has become relatively popular recently. What's the trade? What's going on? What's being traded here, right? Well, somebody who has more money than time, right, is paying someone else who likely has more time than money, right? And so they're paying them to, you know, pick up groceries or pick up dinner for their family, right? When would you DoorDash? When it was worth it to save your time. If it's not worth it, if you're like, well, I don't have anything else going on, you simply would go and do it yourself. There would be no trade there, right? So trade, by its nature, is voluntary. And so when we engage in trade, right, that is making us better off. When I pay somebody else to pick up dinner for me, that's one less thing that I have to do. Maybe I get to spend more time working on my class, right? And then I pay that person, and now that person has money that they didn't have before, and they didn't have opportunity cost, anything else better to do with their time, right? So it's going to make the most of people having different opportunity costs. So we'll get more into that in chapter 2. So those are the 5 foundations of economics. And if you really get to know these can really just change how you approach making decisions. All right, hope to see you soon.